The crowd gathered at the Willow Creek train station parted like the Red Sea as Lillian Foster stepped onto the dusty platform, her white-gloved hands trembling slightly despite her efforts to appear composed. It was 1878, and she'd traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston to this remote Wyoming town to marry a man she'd never met, all because her father's debts had left her with no other choice. "That must be the mail-order bride," someone whispered loudly enough for Lillian to hear. "Saw the advertisement Thomas Blackwood placed in the Eastern papers, paid just $50 for her passage." "A bargain bride," another voice chuckled. "Wonder if she's worth even that much." Lillian straightened her spine, refusing to let the cruel words penetrate her armor. The navy traveling dress she wore had been her mother's, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and the small valise she carried contained everything she now owned in the world. 22 years of life reduced to a single bag and a marriage contract. She scanned the platform, looking for the man who would become her husband by sundown according to their arrangement. Her father's gambling debts had forced her hand, but she'd made her choice with clear eyes. Better to be the wife of a stranger in the West than to face what awaited her in Boston. Thomas Blackwood stood apart from the crowd, his tall frame leaning against a hitching post. Unlike the other men who gawked openly, his gaze was measured, assessing but not unkind. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. At perhaps 30 years of age, he wore his experiences in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he observed the world. When their eyes met across the platform, Lillian felt something unexpected, not love or even attraction, but recognition. Here was someone else who understood what it meant to make difficult choices. She crossed the platform toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. The whispers followed her. $50 for a wife, someone said. Blackwood got himself a bargain. Thomas pushed himself away from the post and stepped forward to meet her halfway. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his otherwise brown eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it escaped his hat. "Miss Foster?" he asked, his voice deeper than she'd imagined from their exchanged letters. "Mr. Blackwood," she confirmed with a slight nod. "I believe you were expecting me." He took her valise without asking, his calloused fingers brushing against hers momentarily. "The wagon's this way." "Town's talking plenty, as you might have noticed." "I noticed," she replied, falling into step beside him. She was tall for a woman, but he still towered over her. "They seem to find our arrangement amusing." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "People talk when they've got nothing better to do, especially about things they don't understand." They reached a modest wagon hitched to two solid-looking horses. Unlike the fancy carriages Lillian had known in Boston, this was a working vehicle, dusty and well-used. Thomas helped her onto the wooden seat before storing her valise in the back. When he climbed up beside her, Lillian was acutely aware of the narrow space between them, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cool spring air. "It's 4 miles to the ranch," he said, taking up the reins. "Not much to look at compared to what you're used to, I expect." Before she could respond, a man approached the wagon, his eyes red, rimmed from drink despite the early hour. "Hey, Blackwood," he called. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride. How much did this one cost you?" $50, they're saying. That true?" Thomas's hands tightened on the reins, but his expression remained impassive. "Move along, Jenkins." The man Jenkins smirked and stepped closer. "Just curious what $50 gets a man these days. Mind if I take a look at what you bought?" Lillian felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the man's existence. Thomas turned slowly, his eyes cold. "Miss Foster isn't something I bought, Jenkins. She's my future wife, and you'll show her the respect she deserves." "Or what?" Jenkins challenged, emboldened by whiskey and an audience. "Or you'll find out exactly why I survived Antietam when better men didn't," Thomas replied, his voice so quiet only Lillian and Jenkins could hear the steel beneath it. Something in Thomas's eyes must have convinced Jenkins to reconsider, because the man stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No harm meant, Blackwood, just having some fun." "Find your fun elsewhere," Thomas suggested before turning back to the reins. With a flick of his wrists, the horses started forward, leaving Jenkins and the Whispers behind. They rode in silence for several minutes, the wagon wheels cutting through the dusty road as they left the small town behind. Lillian watched the landscape change, the buildings giving way to open prairie dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood trees. "I apologize for Jenkins," Thomas finally said, "and for the others, they have no right to speak of you that way." Lillian kept her eyes on the horizon. "They called me a bargain bride. People say foolish things. Is that what I am to you, Mr. Blackwood? A bargain, a good investment for $50. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully for the first time. His expression was complicated frustration mixed with something softer she couldn't name. "Miss Foster, I placed that advertisement because I need a wife. I need someone to help run my household and to be a partner in building something worthwhile. The $50 was for your train ticket, not for you. There isn't a price that could be put on a human being, least of all someone willing to travel across the country to marry a stranger." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I don't expect you to love me. I don't even expect you to like me at first, but I do promise to treat you with respect and to work every day to build a life you won't regret choosing." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. In Boston, men had spoken to her with practiced charm and empty flattery. Thomas Blackwood offered neither, just honest words and a steady gaze. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, equally direct. "I came here with open eyes. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't need pretty words or false promises. I only ask for honesty between us." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we already understand each other better than most married folks." He flicked the reins again, and the horses resumed their steady pace. As they crested a small rise, Thomas nodded toward the valley below. "There it is. Blackwood Ranch." "Not much yet, but it will be." Lillian followed his gaze to see a modest cabin nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills. A barn stood nearby, along with corrals containing horses and cattle. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with trees that offered welcome shade. It wasn't grand by any measure, but there was something appealing about its simplicity, its honest purpose. "It looks peaceful," she said truthfully. Thomas glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Most Eastern ladies would find it lacking." "I'm not most Eastern ladies, Mr. Blackwood, and I stopped being a lady the moment I agreed to marry a stranger for $50. For the first time, Thomas Blackwood laughed a rich, unexpected sound that transformed his face and made him look years younger. "Miss Foster, I think you might be the most honest woman I've ever met." As they approached the cabin, Lillian noticed a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney and a figure moving on the porch. "Your family?" she asked, suddenly nervous. Thomas shook his head. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Oatman. She comes 3 days a week from town. She's here today to help you settle in." He hesitated before adding, "I thought you might be more comfortable having another woman present when you arrived." The thoughtfulness of this gesture touched Lillian more than she cared to admit. "Thank you." As the wagon pulled up to the cabin, Mrs. Oatman came bustling down the steps. She was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "So this is her then?" she asked, looking Lillian up and down with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Oatman, this is Miss Lillian Foster," Thomas said, helping Lillian down from the wagon. "My future wife." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Well, you're a sight prettier than I expected, miss. Come inside. I've got a stew on and the place is all tidied up." As Lillian followed Mrs. Oatman into the cabin, she heard another man's voice outside greeting Thomas. Through the window, she saw a ranch hand approach, leading a magnificent chestnut horse. "Got Thunderer back from the farrier, boss," the man was saying. "That new shoe should hold better now." "Good work, Jake," Thomas replied. "This is an important day. I want everything running smoothly." Lillian turned her attention to the cabin's interior. It was simple but neat, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and handmade furniture was arranged practically around the space. Two doors led off the main room, one presumably to Thomas's bedroom, the other perhaps a storeroom. "Where will I be sleeping?" Lillian asked Mrs. Oatman quietly. The older woman gave her a strange look. "Why, with Mr. Blackwood after the wedding, I expect. That's his room there." She nodded toward one of the doors. "Unless you're planning on postponing the marital aspects." Her tone suggested she found the idea both novel and slightly scandalous. Lillian felt heat rise to her face. In all her practical planning, she had somehow failed to fully consider this most basic aspect of marriage. Of course, she would share her husband's bed. That was the arrangement. "The wedding is today?" she asked instead, changing the subject. "That's the plan," Mrs. Oatman confirmed. "Preacher Williams is coming at 4, just a simple ceremony, mind you, nothing fancy out here." Lillian nodded, running her hands down her travel-worn dress. "I should change then. I have a blue dress that's somewhat nicer than this one." Mrs. Oatman studied her for a moment, then said, "Come with me, miss. I might have something that would suit better." She led Lillian to a cedar chest in the corner of the room and opened it to reveal a cream-colored dress carefully wrapped in muslin. This was Mr. Blackwood's mother's wedding dress, Mrs. Oatman explained. "He asked me to offer it to you, though he was too shy to do so himself, said you should feel no obligation, but that it was here if you wanted it." Lillian touched the fabric gently. It was simple but beautiful, a cream muslin with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs. Not the elaborate satin and lace she might have worn in Boston, but somehow more meaningful. "Why would he offer this?" she asked softly. "He doesn't even know me, Mrs. Oatman closed the chest carefully. "Mr. Blackwood is a man of few words, miss, but that doesn't mean he doesn't feel things deeply. His parents had a good marriage, rare out here. I think he wants to honor that beginning." The door opened, and Thomas stepped inside, removing his hat. He paused when he saw Lillian standing by the chest, and something flickered across his face, uncertainty, perhaps. "I hope Mrs. Oatman is making you feel welcome," he said. "She showed me your mother's dress," Lillian replied directly. "It was very thoughtful of you to offer it." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. "It seemed a shame to leave it in a chest, but you should wear whatever makes you comfortable, Miss Foster." "I would be honored to wear your mother's dress," she told him sincerely. Something changed in his expression, then a softening around the eyes, a certain tension releasing from his shoulders. He nodded once, acknowledging her words without speaking. "I should see to the horses," he said after a moment. "The preacher will be here in a few hours." "If there's anything you need." He let the sentence trail off as if unsure how to finish it. "I'll be fine, Mr. Blackwood," Lillian assured him. "Thank you." After he left, Mrs. Oatman helped Lillian bathe using water heated on the stove and poured into a hip bath set up behind a screen in the bedroom. The warm water was a luxury after days on the train, and Lillian savored it despite its simplicity. As she dressed in the borrowed wedding gown, which fit surprisingly well with only minor adjustments, Lillian caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. She hardly recognized herself. This woman with determined eyes and a resolute expression was far removed from the sheltered Boston socialite she'd been just weeks ago. "You look beautiful, miss," Mrs. Oatman said, helping to arrange Lillian's dark hair in a simple but elegant style. "Mr. Blackwood won't know what hit him. This isn't that kind of marriage, Mrs. Oatman," Lillian felt compelled to explain. "It's an arrangement of mutual benefit." The older woman made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "If you say so, miss. But I've known Thomas Blackwood for 10 years, since he first came to Wyoming territory with nothing but determination and nightmares from the war. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when you stepped off that train." "You were at the station?" Lillian asked, surprised. "Half the town was there," Mrs. Oatman confirmed. "It's not every day a mail-order bride arrives in Willow Creek." "And how exactly did Mr. Blackwood look at me?" Lillian couldn't help asking, though she told herself she was merely curious. Mrs. Oatman's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Like a man seeing the sunrise after the longest night of his life." Before Lillian could respond to this poetic and surely exaggerated description, there was a knock at the door. That'll be Preacher Williams, Mrs. Oatman said, helping Lillian to her feet. Are you ready, miss? Was she ready to marry a stranger, to bind her life to a man she'd met only hours ago? Lillian took a deep breath, centering herself. She had made this choice with clear eyes, trading the familiar horrors of Boston for the unknown possibilities of Wyoming. Whatever happened now, it was a path of her own choosing. I'm ready, she said. The ceremony was brief and simple. Thomas had changed into clean clothes, not formal attire, but a new shirt and his best trousers. He'd clearly made an effort to be presentable, and Lillian appreciated the gesture. When she emerged from the bedroom in his mother's dress, Thomas went completely still. The look on his face wasn't one Lillian could easily interpret. It contained too many emotions layered together, like pages of a book pressed too tightly to read. You look. He began, then seemed to lose the words. Thank you, she replied to the unfinished compliment, understanding somehow what he meant to say. Preacher Williams was a kind-faced man who kept the ceremony appropriately solemn without being overly religious. Jake, the ranch hand, stood as witness alongside Mrs. Oatman. When it came time for the ring, Thomas produced a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. With this ring I thee wed, he said, his voice steady as he slipped it onto her finger. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, there was an awkward moment where neither seemed to know what to do next. Finally, Thomas leaned forward and placed the briefest, most gentle kiss on Lillian's lips, a mere whisper of contact that nevertheless sent an unexpected shiver through her. After a simple celebration meal prepared by Mrs. Oatman, the preacher and Jake departed. Mrs. Oatman lingered only long enough to clear the dishes before tactfully announcing she would see them in 3 days' time. And then, suddenly, Lillian and Thomas were alone, husband and wife strangers. The silence stretched between them as the spring evening settled over the ranch. Through the window, Lillian could see the last rays of sunlight painting the hills gold and pink. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that bore no resemblance to Boston's manicured gardens. I should check on the livestock before full dark, Thomas finally said, reaching for his hat. Lillian nodded, relieved at the temporary reprieve. Of course. When he reached the door, he paused, turning back to her. Mrs. Blackwood, the name, her new name, sounded strange to her ears. Yes. I meant what I said earlier. I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. His meaning was clear, and Lillian felt both grateful for his consideration and strangely disappointed. Thank you, she said simply. After he left, Lillian moved around the cabin, familiarizing herself with what was now her home. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books stacked neatly on a shelf, history volumes, practical guides to ranching, and to her surprise, several novels and books of poetry. Thomas Blackwood was perhaps more complex than she had initially assumed. By the time he returned, Lillian had changed out of the wedding dress and into her nightgown and robe. She sat in a chair by the fire, one of his books open in her lap. Thomas hesitated in the doorway before entering, as if uncertain of his welcome in his own home. Everything's secure for the night, he reported, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg. I hope you don't mind that I borrowed a book, Lillian said, holding up the volume of Wordsworth poems. Something like pleasure flickered across his face. Not at all, my mother loved Wordsworth. Mine as well, Lillian replied, feeling a small connection form between them. Thomas moved toward the bedroom, then stopped. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, he said. Give you time to adjust. Lillian stood, clutching the book to her chest. That's not necessary, Mr. Blackwood. I understand what marriage entails. Thomas, he corrected gently, if we're to be husband and wife, perhaps you should use my given name. Thomas, she repeated, testing the feel of it on her tongue. And I'm Lillian, he nodded, still standing awkwardly by the bedroom door. Lillian, it's a beautiful name. Thank you. She hesitated, then added, my father always called me Lily. Something darkened in Thomas's expression. The man who gambled away your security and sent you to marry a stranger. I think I'll call you Lillian. The fierceness in his tone surprised her. You disapprove of my father's actions? I disapprove of any man who fails to protect those in his care, Thomas replied simply. Though I can't say I'm sorry it brought you here. The admission, small as it was, created a warmth in Lillian's chest. "Nor am I," she found herself saying. "Sorry, that is." They looked at each other across the room, two strangers bound by vows and circumstances, finding their way forward one careful step at a time. "The barn is cold at night," Lillian finally said. "You should sleep in your own bed." Thomas studied her face as if searching for any sign of reluctance or fear. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "If you're certain—" "I am," she replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. That night they shared the bed with a careful distance maintained between them. Thomas was true to his word, making no advances, merely bidding her good night before turning onto his side, his back to her in a gesture of respect. Lillian lay awake for some time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming night, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft whicker of horses in the barn, the creak of the cabin settling. Beside her, Thomas's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, and she found herself studying the outline of his shoulder in the moonlight that filtered through the window. This man was her husband now. This place was her home. Whatever happened from this moment forward would be built on the foundation of choices they both had made, leading them to this night, this bed, this tentative beginning. As sleep finally claimed her, Lillian's last thought was that perhaps, just perhaps, $50 had bought her something priceless, after all a chance to write her own story. The first rays of dawn were filtering through the window when Lillian awoke the next morning. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. The feel of the rough cotton sheets was unfamiliar, the quality of light different from her Boston bedroom. Then memory returned, and with it the awareness that she was no longer Lillian Foster but Lillian Blackwood, mail-order bride, wife to a stranger, except the stranger was gone. Thomas's side of the bed was empty, the covers neatly pulled up. Lillian sat up, listening to the sounds of the cabin. The crackle of a fire, the soft clink of metal against metal. Someone was in the kitchen. Dressing quickly in one of her simpler dresses, Lillian pinned her hair in a practical style and ventured out of the bedroom. To her surprise, Thomas was at the stove, frying bacon in a cast iron skillet. He looked up when she entered, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face before he schooled his expression. "Good morning," he said. "I hope I didn't wake you?" "No, the sun did that," she replied, feeling oddly shy in the bright light of day. "You cook?" A small smile touched his lips. "Mrs. Oatman comes only 3 days a week. The rest of the time it's cook or starve." "I can cook," Lillian offered, moving toward the stove. "It's part of why you wanted a wife, isn't it? Someone to keep house." Thomas turned his attention back to the bacon, flipping it carefully. "It's one reason, yes, but you just arrived yesterday. There's time enough for you to take on household duties." Lillian stood awkwardly, unsure of her place in this new domestic arrangement. In Boston, servants had handled the cooking and cleaning. Here she was the servant in many ways, yet Thomas was treating her more like a guest. "I'd like to be useful," she said finally. "I didn't come all this way to be idle." Thomas glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "No, I don't imagine you did." He gestured to a loaf of bread on the counter. "You could slice that if you'd like, and there's coffee in the pot." They worked together in surprisingly comfortable silence, Lillian slicing bread while Thomas finished the bacon and fried eggs in the remaining fat. When the simple breakfast was ready, they sat across from each other at the wooden table. "What does your day usually look like?" Lillian asked, spreading a bit of butter on her bread. "Up before dawn to check the stock," Thomas replied. "Then whatever needs doing, mending fences, moving cattle, breaking horses. Jake helps and I hire extra hands when necessary, but it's mostly just the two of us." "And what would you have me do today?" Thomas considered this as he sipped his coffee. "Mrs. Oatman keeps the place in good order, but she doesn't live here. I thought perhaps you might want to make the cabin more yours, arrange things as you see fit." The offer surprised Lillian. She had expected to be given specific tasks, not invited to claim ownership of the space. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I would like that." Thomas nodded, seeming pleased with her response. "I should warn you will have visitors today. News travels fast in Willow Creek. Folks will be curious about you." "The bargain bride," Lillian said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. Thomas's expression hardened. Anyone who calls you that to your face will answer to me. The fierceness of his response caught Lillian off guard. You don't need to defend my honor, Thomas. I know what people think. It matters to me what they say, he replied simply. You're my wife now. The word still felt strange applying to her. Wife, such a small word for such a profound change in status. I appreciate the sentiment, she said carefully, but I've faced worse than gossip in Boston. I can handle curious neighbors. Thomas studied her face, then nodded slowly. I believe you can, but you shouldn't have to face it alone. After breakfast, Thomas went out to begin his day's work, leaving Lillian to explore the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its modest size, the home had been built with care. The logs fitted tightly, the windows positioned to catch both morning and afternoon light. Someone had put thought into its construction. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with the stone fireplace providing both heat and a place to cook. Shelves held dishes, books, and a few personal items. A desk in one corner contained papers that Lillian didn't examine, respecting Thomas's privacy. The bedroom they shared was simply furnished with the bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a mirror above it. The second door off the main room led not to a storeroom as Lillian had guessed, but to a small room lined with empty shelves and containing a rocking chair near the window. Lillian stood in the doorway of this room, puzzled by its purpose, until Thomas's voice behind her made her start. I thought it might be a good place for your things, he explained, removing his hat as he stepped into the cabin. Or perhaps a sewing room if you enjoy that. My mother always wanted a room of her own. The thoughtfulness of this gesture, setting aside space just for her in his small home, touched Lillian deeply. That's very kind, she said softly. Thank you. Thomas shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's not much. It's more than I expected, she admitted. More than many husbands would offer. Something flickered in his eyes at that, a shadow of some emotion Lillian couldn't name. I should get back to work, he said abruptly. I just came in for some tools. Before he could leave, there was a knock at the door. Thomas tensed slightly, then sighed. And so it begins. The first visitors were an older couple who introduced themselves as the Hendersons, neighbors whose property bordered Blackwood Ranch to the east. Mrs. Henderson brought a pie as a welcome gift, while Mr. Henderson made a show of discussing cattle with Thomas while clearly evaluating Lillian from the corner of his eye. We were mighty surprised to hear Thomas had sent for a bride, Mrs. Henderson said, settling herself at the table while Lillian poured coffee. He's kept to himself these past years. Barely speaks 10 words together at church socials. My husband is a private person, Lillian replied, the defense coming naturally despite their brief acquaintance. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose at the protective tone. Your husband, she repeated, testing the words. My, that was quick. Married already? Yesterday afternoon, Thomas confirmed, his voice neutral as he accepted a cup of coffee from Lillian. Well, Mrs. Henderson exchanged a look with her husband. That's efficient, no sense waiting when minds are made up, Mr. Henderson observed. Though most folks would have made an event of it, invited the town. We preferred a private ceremony, Lillian said smoothly, settling into the role of wife with surprising ease, though we appreciate the community's interest. Thomas shot her a glance that might have contained a hint of admiration. The Hendersons were followed by 3 more sets of visitors before noon, each bringing small gifts and barely disguised curiosity. With each introduction, Lillian felt herself growing more confident in her new identity as Mrs. Blackwood, answering questions diplomatically while revealing little of substance. Thomas mostly remained silent during these visits, but Lillian noticed he stayed close to the cabin rather than returning to his work, a silent presence supporting her through the scrutiny. After the Wilsons departed, the 5th visitors of the morning, Thomas closed the door with a grimace. I'm sorry about that. Small towns run on gossip. It's fine, Lillian assured him. They're just curious. They're judging, Thomas corrected, wondering if I got my money's worth. The blunt assessment made Lillian flinch despite herself. Thomas noticed immediately, regret washing over his features. I shouldn't have said that, he said quietly. It was crude. It was honest, Lillian countered. And honesty was part of our arrangement, wasn't it? Thomas studied her face, his expression softening. You're remarkable, Lillian Blackwood. Most women would be in tears by now. I'm not most women, she reminded him, and tears solve nothing. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. No, they don't. He reached for his hat, which he'd set aside during the visits. I need to check the north pasture. Will you be all right here alone? I'll be fine, she assured him, though I may bar the door against further visitors. This earned her an actual laugh the second time she'd heard the sound from him. It transformed his face, erasing years and worry lines in an instant. A wise precaution, he agreed. I'll be back before sundown. After he left, Lillian continued exploring and organizing the cabin, making mental notes of what would be needed to transform it from a bachelor's quarters to a proper home. Despite its simplicity, the place had good bones, as her mother would have said, her mother. The thought brought a pang of grief. Lillian Foster had died 3 years ago, never knowing how far her husband's gambling would eventually drive their daughter. Would she have approved of Lillian's choice, of Thomas? Lillian suspected her mother might have liked Thomas Blackwood's straightforward nature and evident respect. Lillian had always valued honesty above charm, substance above style. As promised, Thomas returned before sundown, bringing with him a brace of rabbits for dinner. Lillian had never prepared wild game before, but she was determined to learn. Thomas showed her how to skin and clean the animals, his hands deft and sure as he worked. Where did you learn this? She asked, watching his methodical movements. My father taught me, Thomas replied. He was a trapper before he turned to ranching, could live off the land for months at a time. You speak of him in the past tense, Lillian observed carefully. Thomas nodded, his eyes on his work. Both my parents died 5 years ago. Influenza took them within days of each other. I'm sorry, Lillian said softly. My mother died 3 years ago, pneumonia. Thomas glanced up, their shared grief creating an unexpected connection between them. It leaves a hole nothing fills, doesn't it? Yes, Lillian agreed, grateful for his understanding. Exactly that. They worked together to prepare the meal, Lillian following Thomas's instructions to make a stew with the rabbit meat. As they ate, she found herself wanting to know more about this quiet man who was now her husband. How long have you had this ranch? She asked. 7 years, Thomas replied. Bought the first parcel after the war, added to it when I could. It's small compared to some, but the water rights are good, and the grazing land is fertile. You fought in the war, Lillian asked, though she had guessed as much from his earlier comment to Jenkins about Antietam. Thomas's expression closed slightly. Union Army, enlisted in '62, served until Appomattox. He offered no further details, and Lillian sensed this was territory to approach with caution. My father fought as well, she said instead, though his service was brief. He took a bullet at Bull Run and was sent home. Many were, Thomas acknowledged. He was silent for a moment, then asked, Your father, is he still in Boston? Lillian stared down at her plate. I don't know. After my mother died, the gambling grew worse. He'd disappear for days, then return with empty pockets and new debts. The last time was different. He took everything of value, including my mother's jewelry. When he didn't return for 3 weeks, creditors came to the house. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but once started, the words continued to flow. They said I had 2 choices: work off his debts in a manner no respectable woman would consider, or find myself on the street. That's when I saw your advertisement in the newspaper. Thomas's face had darkened as she spoke, his jaw tightening with each word. You did what you had to do, he said finally. There's no shame in that. No, Lillian agreed, meeting his eyes. There isn't, but there's no going back either. This is my life now. Is that so terrible? Thomas asked, the question careful, measured. Lillian considered this, looking around the simple cabin that was now her home. No, she said truthfully, it isn't terrible at all. The honesty of her response seemed to please Thomas. He reached across the table, hesitating just short of touching her hand. I want you to be happy here, Lillian, or at least content. I believe I could be, she admitted. In time. That night they again shared the bed with careful distance between them. But as Lillian drifted towards sleep, she felt Thomas's hand reach across the space to rest lightly on hers, a tentative bridge across the gap separating them. She let her fingers curl around his, a silent acknowledgement of the connection forming between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. The next week passed in a blur of adjustments and discoveries as Lillian settled into her new life at Blackwood Ranch. Each day brought fresh challenges and small triumphs as she learned the rhythms of ranch life and her role within it. Mrs. Oatman proved to be a valuable guide, teaching Lillian how to manage the particular challenges of a frontier household, everything from keeping foodstuffs safe from rodents to preserving eggs with lime water. The older woman was brusque but kind, and Lillian found herself grateful for both her practical knowledge and her lack of judgment about the unusual circumstances of the marriage. "Mr. Blackwood's a good man, Mrs. Oatman told her on the third day as they worked together to make soap from tallow and lye. "Quiet, yes, and carrying burdens most don't see, but honest to his bones and gentle with those in his care." "You've known him a long time?" Lillian asked, carefully stirring the caustic mixture. "Since he first came to Wyoming. Hardly more than a boy then, though the war had aged him beyond his years." Mrs. Oatman's expression softened with memory. "He worked for every rancher in the county, saving his money, learning the trade, never complained, never boasted. Just put his head down and built something from nothing." Lillian found herself wanting to know more about the man she had married, but hesitant to pry too deeply too soon. Instead, she observed him, the care he took with his animals, the respect he showed to Jake and the occasional hired hands, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. For his part, Thomas seemed equally engaged in learning about Lillian. He noticed her preferences, without her having to state them, providing extra coffee in the morning when he realized she enjoyed it, bringing wildflowers from the pasture that appeared in a jar on the table, finding moments to ask about her day while never making her feel scrutinized. On the fifth day, Thomas brought home a surprise, a small upright piano purchased from a family leaving the territory. "It's not new," he apologized as Jake helped him position it against the wall of the main room. "And probably out of tune, but you mentioned you played and I thought." Lillian stared at the instrument, overcome with emotion. It was an extravagant gift, especially for a ranch that operated on careful margins. "How did you even get it here?" she asked, running her fingers reverently over the keys. "Borrowed Johnson's wagon," Thomas explained. "It's been sitting in the general store for 2 months. No one else wanted to pay the freight to ship it east." "It's beautiful," Lillian whispered, pressing a key and wincing slightly at the sour note. "Though you're right about it needing tuning." "Can you do that?" Thomas asked. "I know nothing about pianos. My father insisted I learn to tune our piano in Boston," Lillian replied. "He said it was too expensive to call in a professional every time the weather changed the tension of the strings." For once, the mention of her father didn't bring a shadow to Thomas's expression. Instead, he seemed pleased by this unexpected skill. "Then it's yours to command," he said, gesturing to the instrument. "A proper home should have music." The casual reference to their shared home to the life they were building together warmed Lillian in a way she hadn't anticipated. This man, who had advertised for a practical wife, was proving to have unexpected depths of thoughtfulness. That evening after dinner, Lillian worked on tuning the piano while Thomas sat nearby, ostensibly reading but clearly enjoying watching her work. When the instrument was finally producing reasonable sounds, she hesitated before playing. "My skills are modest," she warned him. "I was never as dedicated a student as my teacher hoped." "Play anyway," Thomas encouraged. "It's been a long time since this house heard music." Lillian began with a simple folk melody, her fingers remembering the patterns despite months without practice. The piano's tone was warm if not perfect, filling the cabin with sound that seemed to transform the simple space into something more refined, more settled. When she finished the first piece, she glanced at Thomas to find him watching her with an expression of such open appreciation that it made her breath catch. "Another?" he asked quietly. Lillian turned back to the keys, playing a Chopin nocturne that had been her mother's favorite. The music flowed through her, carrying emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel: grief for what she had lost, fear of the unknown future, but also hope for what might be building in this new life. When the final notes faded, the silence felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "That was beautiful." Lillian smiled, surprised by how much his appreciation meant to her. "The piano was a wonderful gift, Thomas. I can't tell you how much it means to me." "Your happiness means something to me," he replied, the words clearly chosen with care. "I want you to have reasons to stay beyond our arrangement." The honesty of this statement, the vulnerability beneath it, touched Lillian deeply. This man who had advertised for a bride had truly been seeking a partner, someone to share his life and home in all its aspects. "I'm not going anywhere," she assured him, the promise coming naturally despite their short acquaintance. Something in Thomas's expression eased at her words, a tension releasing that she hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. He reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it rested on the piano bench. "I'm glad," he said simply. That night when they retired, the careful distance they had maintained in the bed seemed to shrink by unspoken mutual consent. Thomas's arm brushed against Lillian's as they settled beneath the covers, and neither moved away from the contact. It was a small step, but significant, like the first notes of a melody that might, in time, become something complex and beautiful. On the morning of their 10th day as husband and wife, Lillian awoke to find herself curled against Thomas's side, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. They had gravitated toward each other in sleep, seeking warmth and connection beyond conscious thought. For a moment, Lillian remained perfectly still, absorbing the novel sensation of such intimate contact. Thomas's heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, his breathing deep and even in sleep. The solid warmth of him was comforting in a way she hadn't anticipated. Carefully, not wanting to wake him, Lillian began to ease away. But Thomas's arm tightened almost imperceptibly around her, and his eyes opened, finding hers in the early morning light. "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered, embarrassed to be caught in such a position. "I didn't mean to. Don't apologize," Thomas interrupted gently. "Please." The look in his eyes made Lillian's breath catch warmth and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. For a long moment they simply gazed at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Thomas cleared his throat and released her, sitting up. "I should get an early start today. There's a storm coming, according to Jake's knee." Lillian blinked at the abrupt shift, feeling oddly bereft as he moved away. "His knee predicts weather," Thomas's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "More accurately than any barometer I've seen. Old war injury acts up before a pressure change." He rose and dressed with efficient movements while Lillian remained in bed, watching him through lowered lashes. There was a grace to Thomas that belied his size, an economy of motion that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite the scars she had glimpsed on his back and shoulders. When he left to begin his chores, Lillian finally rose, her thoughts turbulent. Something was changing between them, had been changing since the moment she stepped off the train. What had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Later that morning, as Lillian hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she spotted riders approaching from the direction of town, 3 men on horseback, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of social visitors. She watched, a vague unease settling in her stomach as the men dismounted near the barn where Thomas and Jake were working. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in Thomas's posture as he spoke with them. Unable to contain her curiosity, Lillian moved closer, gathering empty baskets as a pretext for her approach. As she drew near enough to hear, one of the men's voices carried clearly. "Just passing through, Blackwood. Thought you'd want to know, considering your history with him." "When was he seen?" Thomas asked, his voice tight in a way Lillian hadn't heard before. 2 days ago in Cheyenne," replied another man, whom Lillian now recognized as Sheriff Davis from Willow Creek. "Robbed the bank there, killed a teller, headed this direction according to witnesses." Reed wouldn't come back here, Thomas said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Not after what happened last time. Men like Silas Reed don't always make rational choices, the sheriff observed, especially when they carry grudges. Thomas noticed Lillian then, his expression shifting from concern to something carefully neutral. "Lillian, did you need something?" All three visitors turned to look at her, and Lillian straightened her spine under their scrutiny. "Just collecting the baskets," she explained, holding them up as evidence. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Mrs. Blackwood, Sheriff Davis, greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "Apologies for not stopping by sooner to welcome you properly to the county." "You're here now, Sheriff," Lillian replied evenly. "Though I gather this isn't a social call." The men exchanged glances, and Thomas stepped forward, clearly intending to shield her from whatever they had been discussing. "Just county business," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." The dismissal stung, reminding Lillian sharply of how new their relationship was, how many secrets still lay between them. But she merely nodded, respecting his obvious desire to protect her. "I'll leave you to it then," she said, gathering her baskets and returning to the cabin. From the window, she watched as the conversation continued, noting the gravity in all four men's expressions. Whatever or whoever they were discussing clearly represented a serious concern. Yet Thomas had chosen to keep her in the dark, treating her more like a child to be sheltered than a partner to be trusted. When the riders departed, and Thomas returned to the cabin some time later, Lillian was waiting, her expression composed but determined. "Who is Silas Reed?" She asked directly. Thomas paused in the doorway, surprise and wariness crossing his features. "You were listening." "I overheard," Lillian corrected. "There's a difference, and you're avoiding my question." For a moment she thought he might continue to evade, but then Thomas sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "Reed is an outlaw," he finally said. "Used to ride with the Dalton gang before striking out on his own. He has a history in this county." "And with you specifically," Lillian pressed, sensing there was more to the story. "The sheriff mentioned your history with him." Thomas's expression tightened. "It was a long time ago." "Before I established the ranch." "Thomas," Lillian said softly, crossing to stand before him, "if there's danger coming to our home, I deserve to know about it. I'm not a delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of trouble." His eyes met hers, searching her face as if gauging her resilience. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "After the war," he began, "I worked as a deputy in Cheyenne for a time. Reed and his gang robbed the bank there, killed the manager. I was part of the posse that tracked them down." He paused, the memory clearly difficult. "There was a shootout. Reed's brother died along with two of my fellow deputies. Reed took a bullet but escaped. He swore revenge. And now he's been seen headed this way," Lillian concluded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Thomas nodded, his expression grim. "It may be nothing. Reed's been spotted a dozen times in the last 5 years, never closed to here, but with a fresh robbery and murder to his name. He might be desperate enough to settle old scores," Lillian finished. "Yes," Thomas studied her face. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you immediately. I wanted to protect you from this part of my past." "I appreciate the instinct," Lillian said carefully, "but I would rather know the truth, however difficult, than be kept in comfortable ignorance." A small smile touched Thomas's lips despite the gravity of the moment. "You continue to surprise me, Lillian Blackwood." "Good," she replied simply. "Now, what preparations should we make in case this Reed does come looking for you?" The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard, as if he had expected fear or recriminations rather than practical planning. After a moment's consideration, he began outlining precautions: extra ammunition kept ready, doors locked at night, a signal arranged with Jake, who lived in a small cabin near the barn. Lillian listened attentively, asking questions where appropriate and offering suggestions of her own. By the time they finished discussing the matter, Thomas was looking at her with undisguised admiration. Most women would be packing their bags at the prospect of an outlaw vendetta, he observed. "I told you before I'm not most women," Lillian reminded him. And I didn't travel across the country to run at the first sign of trouble. Thomas stepped closer, the space between them suddenly charged with something beyond their discussion of danger. No, he agreed softly, you didn't. His hand came up to touch her cheek, the gesture tentative, questioning. Lillian remained still, her heart beating rapidly as his calloused fingers traced the curve of her face with surprising gentleness. You are. Thomas began, then seemed to lose the words. Instead of finishing the thought, he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away. Lillian didn't move. Instead, she tilted her face up to his, an unspoken invitation. Their lips met in a kiss, unlike the brief, ceremonial one they had shared at their wedding. This was exploration, question and answer, the first true expression of the connection building between them. Thomas's hand cradled her face as if she were something precious, while Lillian found herself reaching up to steady herself against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. I didn't expect this, he confessed quietly. When I placed that advertisement, I thought I was arranging a practical partnership I never imagined. Nor did I, Lillian admitted, her own voice barely above a whisper, but I'm not sorry. No, Thomas agreed, drawing back slightly to look into her eyes. Neither am I. The moment was interrupted by a distant rumble of thunder. Jake's knee had been right about the approaching storm. Thomas glanced toward the window, responsibility warring with the desire Lillian could read in his eyes. I need to secure the stock before that hits, he said reluctantly. The younger horses spook at lightning. Lillian nodded, understanding. Go, I'll be here when you return. The simple promise seemed to mean a great deal to Thomas, who brushed his lips against hers once more before retrieving his hat and heading back out into the increasingly gusty afternoon. Alone in the cabin, Lillian touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the impression of Thomas's kiss. Whatever had begun between them as a practical arrangement was evolving into something far more complex and potentially beautiful. The thought both thrilled and frightened her to care was to risk pain, as her mother's death and father's abandonment had taught her all too well. Yet as she moved about the cabin, securing windows against the coming storm and preparing a hearty stew for dinner, Lillian found herself embracing the risk. Thomas Blackwood was a man worth caring for, worth trusting with her heart as well as her future. The storm broke with dramatic intensity just as Thomas and Jake finished securing the last of the animals. From the cabin window, Lillian watched the two men sprint from the barn through sheets of driving rain, arriving at their respective shelters soaked to the skin. Thomas stepped through the door on a gust of wind, water streaming from his hat and coat. Lillian immediately brought a towel, helping him remove his dripping outer garments. That came on faster than expected, he said, accepting the towel gratefully. Should pass by morning, though. The stew's ready whenever you are, Lillian told him, moving back to the stove to stir the pot. And I found some cornbread in the pantry that Mrs. Oatman must have left. Thomas finished drying his hair, leaving it charmingly mussed, and approached the stove. The domestic normalcy of the moment struck Lillian suddenly. This could have been their 100th evening together rather than one of their first. After dinner, with rain drumming steadily on the roof and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the windows, they sat together near the fire. Thomas had brought in additional logs earlier, ensuring they would stay warm through the night. Tell me about Boston, Thomas said unexpectedly, his voice soft in the firelit room. What do you miss most? Lillian considered the question, realizing with some surprise that she had thought little of her former home in recent days. The libraries, perhaps, she finally answered, and the music concerts and opera. Not the people, Thomas asked curiously. There were few I was close to, Lillian admitted. After my mother died and my father's gambling worsened, many of our so-called friends distanced themselves. Society has little patience for falling fortunes. Thomas's expression darkened at the mention of her father, as it often did. Their loss, he said simply, their failure to value you has become my gain. The directness of this statement, the unvarnished sentiment behind it, warmed Lillian more than the fire before them. What about you? She asked. Where were you before Wyoming, Pennsylvania originally? Thomas replied. Farm country. My father worked land that belonged to others until the war came. After Appomattox, I couldn't go back to that life, needed open skies and space to breathe. Because of what you saw in the war, Lillian asked gently. Thomas stared into the fire, shadows playing across his face. Because of what I did in the war, he corrected quietly. There are actions that change a man, Lillian, make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. Lillian reached across the space between their chairs, taking his hand in hers. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Someday, he promised, squeezing her fingers. Not tonight. Tonight, I'd rather talk about happier things. They spent the evening sharing stories, Lillian's school days at a Boston academy for young ladies, Thomas's early struggles establishing the ranch, books they had both read, places they hoped to see. With each exchange, the space between their lives before narrowed, connections forming like bridges across the divide. When they finally retired to bed, the careful distance they had maintained was gone. Thomas drew Lillian into his arms as naturally as if they'd been sharing such intimacy for years rather than hours. She went willingly, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear while rain pattered against the roof above them. Is this all right? He asked softly, his hand stroking gently along her back. Yes, Lillian whispered, realizing it was more than all right. It was exactly where she wanted to be. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. The kiss they had shared had opened a door, and neither seemed inclined to close it again. In the days that followed, they explored this new dimension between them, hands lingering during the passing of objects, stolen kisses between chores, conversations that stretched late into the evening as they discovered each other's minds and hearts. 2 weeks after Lillian's arrival, Thomas announced he needed to make a trip to Cheyenne for supplies and to sell some horses. It's a 3-day journey there and back, he explained over breakfast. Jake will stay close to the house while I'm gone. Lillian nodded, hiding her disappointment at the prospect of his absence. When will you leave? Tomorrow at first light, Thomas replied, watching her face carefully. Unless you'd prefer I wait. The consideration in this offer, his willingness to adjust his plans for her comfort, touched Lillian deeply. No, you should go. The sooner you leave, the sooner you'll return. Thomas smiled at this, reaching across the table to take her hand. I'll bring you something from town, he promised. Just bring yourself back safely, Lillian told him, turning her hand to lace her fingers with his. That's all I need. The naked emotion in Thomas's eyes at her words made Lillian's breath catch. This man who had advertised for a practical marriage was looking at her with feelings that went far beyond practicality. Lillian, he began, his voice rough with emotion, these past weeks, they've meant more to me than I can properly express. They've meant a great deal to me as well, she admitted softly. Thomas took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. When I placed that advertisement, I thought I was seeking a partner for practical reasons, someone to share the work and build a life with. I never expected to feel this way. What way? Lillian asked, her heart beating rapidly. Thomas's thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand as he considered his response. Like I've found something I didn't even know I was missing, he finally said. Something precious beyond measure. The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound in their honesty. Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up from some deep place within her. The people in town, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, they called me a bargain bride. As if you had purchased me for $50, Thomas's expression hardened. You are not, let me finish, Lillian interrupted gently. They called me a bargain, but what I've found here with you, it's beyond price, Thomas. This life we're building together, this connection between us, it's worth more than all the fortunes in Boston. For a moment, Thomas seemed unable to speak, overcome by her words. Then he rose from his chair, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. You're priceless to me, Lillian, he murmured against her hair. Worth infinitely more than I could ever deserve. Their lips met in a kiss that conveyed what words could not, the depth of feeling that had grown between them in such a short time, the promise of all that might yet be. That night, for the first time, they truly became husband and wife in every sense, their physical union a natural extension of the emotional connection they had built. In Thomas's arms, Lillian discovered aspects of herself she had never known, depths of passion and tenderness that answered his own. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you," he whispered, the words both declaration and revelation. "I think I have since you stepped off that train and faced down the whispers with your head held high." Lillian raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes, moonlight from the window illuminating his face. "And I love you," she replied, the truth of it filling her completely. "Not because you rescued me from Boston or gave me a home, but because of who you are, your kindness, your honesty, your strength." Thomas pulled her close again, his arms secure around her. "Sleep now," he murmured. "Dawn comes early and I have a long ride tomorrow." Lillian nestled against him, savoring the warmth and security of his embrace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whether from outlaws with old grudges or simply the everyday trials of ranch life, they would face them together. No longer strangers bound by a contract, but partners united by love. Thomas departed as planned the next morning, leaving Lillian with a lingering kiss and a promise to return as quickly as possible. Jake, true to his word, stayed close to the ranch, checking on Lillian several times throughout the day while maintaining a respectful distance. On the second day of Thomas's absence, Lillian was hanging laundry when she noticed a rider approaching from the north, not the direction of town. Something about the man's posture set alarm bells ringing in her mind even before she could make out his features. Trying to appear casual, Lillian finished hanging the sheet she held, then made her way toward the cabin, glancing toward the barn where she knew Jake was repairing tack. The ranch hand had seen the rider too. He was already moving toward the house, his hand resting near the gun at his hip. "Mrs. Blackwood," Jake called, his voice carrying clearly. "Might be best if you went inside." Lillian nodded, understanding the warning. As she reached the porch, she heard hoofbeats approaching at a trot. Against her better judgment, she turned to look. The rider was a lean man with a weathered face and cold eyes. His clothes were trail-worn, but his guns, 2 revolvers holstered at his hips, looked well maintained. As he drew closer, Lillian could see a scar running from his left temple down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. "Afternoon, madam," the stranger called, touching the brim of his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Might your husband be about? Mr. Blackwood is away on business," Jake answered before Lillian could speak. "Can I help you with something?" The stranger's eyes never left Lillian, a calculating look in them that made her skin crawl. "And you must be the new Mrs. Blackwood," he said, ignoring Jake entirely. "Heard tell Thomas had sent east for a bride, paid $50, they say." His mouth twisted in a mockery of a smile. "Quite a bargain." The words, so similar to those whispered at the train station, took on a sinister quality from this man's lips. Lillian straightened her spine, refusing to show fear. "I'm afraid my husband won't return for several days," she said evenly. "If you have business with him, you'll need to come back then." "Oh, I have business with Thomas Blackwood, all right," the man agreed, his hand resting casually near one of his guns. "Old business, unfinished business." Jake had moved closer, positioning himself between Lillian and the rider. "State your name and purpose," he demanded, all pretense of courtesy gone from his voice. The stranger laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Name's Silas Reed. Purpose is my own affair. But since Thomas isn't here to receive my respects, perhaps I'll just wait for him. Get acquainted with his lovely bride in the meantime." Lillian felt cold fear wash through her at the name. This was the outlaw Thomas had spoken of, the man with a vendetta against her husband, and he had deliberately come when Thomas was away. "That won't be necessary," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "As I said, my husband won't return for days. You'd be better served coming back next week." Reed swung down from his horse with fluid grace that belied his trail-worn appearance. "Now that would be downright inhospitable, Mrs. Blackwood, and I've heard such good things about Eastern manners." Jake's hand moved to his gun. That's far enough, Reed. The outlaw's eyes flicked to Jake for the first time, assessing him with cold calculation. You willing to die for Blackwood's woman, boy? Because that's what pointing that gun at me means. Jake, Lillian said quietly, go check on the north pasture fence. I believe Mr. Reed and I can manage a civil conversation. Jake looked at her in disbelief. Mrs. Blackwood, I can't leave you alone with it's all right, Lillian interrupted, her eyes conveying a message she hoped he would understand. Go for help. Mr. Reed and I are just going to talk and then he'll be on his way. Isn't that right, Mr. Reed? The outlaw smiled, cold and predatory. Absolutely, madam, just a friendly visit. Jake hesitated, clearly torn between his promise to Thomas and Lillian's implicit request. Finally, he gave a tight nod. I'll check that fence then, won't be gone long. As Jake mounted his horse and rode away, Lillian silently prayed he was heading for town to alert the sheriff. In the meantime, she would have to manage Reed alone. Won't you come in, Mr. Reed? She invited, gesturing toward the cabin door. I just made coffee. Reed followed her inside, his spurs jingling with each step. In the confined space of the cabin, he seemed larger, more threatening. Lillian moved to the stove, grateful for the routine task of pouring coffee that gave her something to do with her trembling hands. Sugar. She asked as if this were any normal visitor. Sweet enough for my taste already, Reed replied, his eyes roving over her in a way that made Lillian's skin crawl. He settled himself in Thomas's chair, deliberately marking the territory. So tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, how does a pretty thing like you end up the mail-order bride of a man like Thomas? Fallen on hard times back east. Lillian placed a cup of coffee before him, then retreated to stand near the fireplace, maintaining distance between them. My circumstances are not your concern, Mr. Reed. Reed took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. No, I thought we were having a friendly chat. There's nothing friendly about your presence here, Lillian countered, abandoning pretense. You came because you knew my husband was away. Because you're too much of a coward to face him directly. Anger flashed in Reed's eyes, his hand tightening on the coffee cup. Your husband shot my brother dead, left me with this. He gestured to the scar on his face. I'd say that earns me the right to choose the terms of our reunion. By threatening an unarmed woman, Lillian challenged. That hardly seems the action of a man seeking justice. Reed set down the cup with deliberate care. Who said anything about justice, Mrs. Blackwood? I'm interested in something far more satisfying, revenge. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. I'm going to take everything from Thomas Blackwood, just as he took everything from me, starting with you. Lillian felt cold fear wash through her, but she refused to show it. If you harm me, he'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. That's the plan, Reed agreed with a terrible smile. I want him to suffer first, to know what it feels like to lose what matters most. As he rose from the chair, Lillian backed away, her mind racing. The rifle was in the bedroom, too far to reach. The kitchen knife was behind her on the counter, but Reed would see any move she made toward it. You won't get away with this, she said, playing for time. The ranch hand has gone for the sheriff by now, Reed laughed. Sheriff's office is an hour's hard ride from here. By then, we'll be long gone. He took a step toward her. Now, we can do this the easy way, or the sound of a gun being cocked froze them both. Or you can die where you stand, came Thomas's voice from the doorway. Step away from my wife, Reed. Lillian's heart leapt at the sound. Thomas stood in the open doorway, his rifle aimed steadily at Reed's chest, his expression more coldly furious than she had ever seen it. Reed recovered quickly from his surprise, a calculating smile spreading across his face. Thomas Blackwood, early return from your trip. Or did you never leave at all? Last warning, Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. Step away from Lillian. Reed raised his hands slowly, but Lillian could see the coiled tension in his body. Now, Thomas, that's no way to treat a guest. Your lovely wife and I were just getting acquainted. Mr. Reed was just leaving, Lillian said, her voice steadier than she felt. She began edging toward Thomas, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Reed's eyes flicked between them, measuring angles and opportunities. You know, Thomas, they say you got quite a bargain with this one. $50 for a wife, but I'm thinking she might be worth a bit more than that." His hand dropped slightly toward his gun. "What do you think she's worth to you right now?" Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "She's priceless," he said quietly. "Something a man like you could never understand." Reed's move was lightning fast, diving to the side as he drew his gun, but Thomas was ready, squeezing off a shot that caught Reed in the shoulder, spinning him around. The outlaw's gun discharged wildly, the bullet splintering wood near the ceiling. "Thomas!" Lillian cried as Reed staggered but remained upright, his gun still in hand. "Get down," Thomas ordered, positioning himself between Lillian and Reed as the outlaw raised his weapon again. Two more shots rang out almost simultaneously. Thomas jerked backward, a red stain blooming on his shirt even as Reed collapsed to the floor, a neat hole in the center of his forehead. "Thomas!" Lillian rushed to her husband as he slumped against the doorframe, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Oh God, Thomas, no." "I'm all right," he gasped, though the spreading bloodstain on his shirt belied his words. "Just a graze. Check Reed." Lillian glanced at the outlaw's still form, the sightless eyes staring at the ceiling. "He's dead," she confirmed, helping Thomas to a chair. "Let me see your wound." With shaking hands, she unbuttoned his shirt to reveal a bloody furrow across his ribs. The bullet had carved a path through flesh without penetrating, deeply painful but not immediately life-threatening. "You need a doctor," she said, reaching for a clean towel to press against the wound. "Later," Thomas said, gripping her arms. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" "No," Lillian assured him. "I'm fine. He had only just arrived when you came." Relief washed over Thomas's face, followed quickly by a grimace of pain as he shifted position. "Thank God," he murmured. "When I saw his horse outside." "How did you know to come back?" Lillian asked, still pressing the towel to his wound. "Never left," Thomas admitted. "After what the sheriff said about Reed being in the area, I couldn't bring myself to go. Told Jake to maintain the fiction that I was gone, hoping to draw Reed out if he was watching the ranch." His eyes darkened with self-recrimination. "I never thought he'd approach you directly. I should have warned you. You couldn't have known," Lillian soothed. "And you were here when it mattered." Thomas reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle despite the pain he must have been feeling. "When I saw him standing near you, his hand on his gun." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. "I've never been so frightened in my life, Lillian." "Not even at Antietam?" The naked emotion in his voice moved Lillian deeply. This was a man who had faced the worst horrors of war, yet the thought of losing her had terrified him more. "I'm safe," she assured him, covering his hand with hers. "We both are." The sound of hoofbeats outside announced Jake's return, presumably with help from town. But before the others arrived, Thomas pulled Lillian closer, his eyes intense despite the pain he must have been feeling. "I love you," he said fiercely. "More than I thought it possible to love another person. When they called you a bargain bride, they had no idea how wrong they were." Lillian felt tears fill her eyes as she leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "No price could be put on what we've found together," she whispered. "It truly is priceless." The aftermath of Reed's attack brought changes to Blackwood Ranch. The sheriff and his deputies removed the outlaw's body, taking statements from Thomas, Lillian, and Jake about what had transpired. The doctor from Willow Creek treated Thomas's wound, declaring him lucky that the bullet had done no more serious damage. Word spread quickly through the county how Thomas Blackwood had protected his mail-order bride from a notorious outlaw. How Mrs. Blackwood had kept her composure under threat, how the pair had faced danger together with remarkable courage. "They're not calling you a bargain bride anymore, Mrs. Oatman reported with satisfaction 2 weeks after the incident, as she helped Lillian preserve peaches from the small orchard behind the cabin. "Now they're saying Thomas got himself a woman worth her weight in gold." Lillian smiled at this, glancing through the window to where Thomas was chopping wood, his movements careful as his wound continued to heal. "People will always talk," she observed. "What matters is what we know to be true." And the truth, as Lillian had discovered in her short time at Blackwood Ranch, was that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents: courage, loyalty, respect. and most of all, love. What had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers had blossomed into something neither had expected to find. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas took Lillian's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "This cabin was built for a bachelor. It served its purpose, but perhaps it's time for something more." Lillian looked at him questioningly. "What did you have in mind?" "A proper house," Thomas replied. "With more rooms, bigger windows, space for a family someday." He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "If that's something you might want." The thought of children, of expanding their family beyond the two of them, filled Lillian with unexpected warmth. "I would like that very much," she admitted softly. Thomas's face lit with pleasure at her response. "I've been setting aside lumber, making plans. We could start building before winter sets in." "Where would you put it?" Lillian asked, intrigued by his enthusiasm. Thomas pointed to a gentle rise overlooking the creek. "There. Better view, more protection from the wind, room to grow." As Lillian looked where he indicated, she could almost see it a home built not from necessity or practicality alone, but from hope and confidence in their shared future. "It sounds perfect," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Though I've been happy here too." Thomas pressed a kiss to her hair. "You've made it a home, Lillian, something it never was before you came." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. From the barn came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night, while a coyote called in the distance the music of Wyoming that had become as familiar to Lillian as Boston's city noises had once been. "I received a letter today," Thomas said eventually. "From Boston." Lillian straightened, surprised. "From whom?" "A lawyer," Thomas explained. "I wrote some weeks ago making inquiries about your father's debts. I hope you don't mind." "What did you discover?" Lillian asked, curious rather than offended by his initiative. Thomas took a folded paper from his pocket. "The debts were substantial but not insurmountable. I've arranged to pay them off." Lillian stared at him in astonishment. "Thomas, you can't. The ranch, our plans for the house are secure," he assured her. "The cattle sale in Cheyenne brought a good price. We can afford this, Lillian." "But why?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "My father abandoned me to those creditors. He doesn't deserve your help." Thomas considered this, choosing his words with care. "I'm not doing it for him," he explained. "I'm doing it for you, so you never have to look over your shoulder, wondering if the past might find you again." The thoughtfulness of this gesture, his desire to give her not just a home but peace of mind, moved Lillian deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, finding words inadequate to express her gratitude. Thomas squeezed her hand. "There's more. The lawyer found your father," Lillian's breath caught. "Is he?" "Alive," Thomas confirmed, "in a sanatorium outside Boston. Apparently he suffered some kind of collapse after gambling away the last of your mother's jewelry. He's been there for months." A complex mixture of emotions washed through Lillian: relief that her father was alive, sadness for his condition, anger at his failures, and a surprising measure of pity. "I see," she said quietly. "If you wanted to see him," Thomas offered, "we could make the journey east or bring him here if that's what you prefer." The offer was generous beyond measure, not just the financial aspect, but Thomas's willingness to welcome into their home the man whose actions had forced Lillian into a mail-order marriage. "You would do that?" she asked, searching his face in the fading light. "I would do anything that brought you peace," Thomas replied simply. "He's your father, despite everything." Lillian considered the possibilities, then shook her head slowly. "Perhaps someday, but not now. This is our time, Thomas, to build our home, our family, our future. I don't want shadows from the past darkening what we've found together." Thomas nodded, accepting her decision without question. "Whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I'll support you." "I know you will," Lillian said, leaning up to kiss him softly. "It's one of the many reasons I love you." As darkness settled fully over Blackwood Ranch, Thomas helped Lillian to her feet. "Come inside, wife," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Tomorrow will be a busy day." Hand in hand, they entered the cabin that had become their first shared home, closing the door on the vast Wyoming night. Inside, the fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, casting golden light over the simple furnishings that had become precious through association, the table where they shared meals, the chairs where they talked late into the evening, the piano that filled their home with music. In the bedroom, Thomas drew Lillian into his arms, his kiss deeper and more purposeful than the one they had shared on the porch. Since his recovery from the wound Reed had inflicted, their physical relationship had blossomed alongside their emotional connection, each discovering in the other a passion that matched their growing love. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, Lillian traced the healing scar on Thomas's side, a permanent reminder of how close they had come to losing their future together before it had truly begun. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about what you said regarding a family." Thomas propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with tenderness. "Yes," Lillian took his hand, guiding it to rest on her stomach. "It might be happening sooner than we planned," she whispered. "I'm not certain yet, but I've missed my monthly time and I've been feeling different. Tender in places, queasy in the mornings." Wonder spread across Thomas's face, followed by a joy so pure it brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "A baby," he breathed, his voice hushed with awe. "Our baby, perhaps," Lillian cautioned. "It's too early to be sure." But Thomas was already pressing reverent kisses to her still flat abdomen, his hands gentle as they cradled where their child might be growing. "Hello, little one," he murmured against her skin. "Your parents are very happy to meet you." Lillian laughed, combing her fingers through his hair. "You're getting ahead of yourself, Thomas. I could be mistaken." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with emotion in the dim light. "Whether it's now or later, Lillian, the fact remains you've given me everything I never dared hope for, a true partner, a love I never thought possible. And now, perhaps, a family of our own." As he moved back up to claim her lips in a tender kiss, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate circumstances in Boston to profound happiness in Wyoming. What had begun with an advertisement and $50 had transformed into something beyond price. "They called me a bargain bride," she whispered against his lips, "but what we've found together is priceless," Thomas finished for her, gathering her close against his heart. 5 years later, Lillian Blackwood stood on the porch of their home, not the modest cabin where they had begun their life together, but the spacious house Thomas had promised her, built on the rise overlooking the creek. With its generous windows capturing the Wyoming light, its comfortable rooms designed for both practicality and beauty, the house had become the heart of an expanding Blackwood ranch. From her vantage point, Lillian could see Thomas in the distance, riding alongside their eldest child, 4-year-old Alina, who sat proudly on her own pony. Behind them, the ranch stretched in all directions, more cattle, more hands to manage them, prosperity built through hard work and wise decisions. At her feet, 2-year-old James played with wooden blocks, constructing towers only to knock them down with delighted giggles. Inside, their newest addition, 3-month-old Rebecca, slept in the cradle Thomas had carved by hand during the long winter evenings. In 5 years, Lillian had watched her husband transform from a solitary man haunted by his past into a loving father who delighted in his children's laughter. She had seen the ranch prosper under their joint management, her Eastern education complementing Thomas's practical knowledge in ways neither could have anticipated. And she herself had changed from a desperate young woman fleeing her father's debts to a confident wife and mother, respected in the community not for her Boston background but for her own merits. She taught piano to the children of Willow Creek, helped organize the town's first library, and worked alongside Thomas as a true partner in all aspects of their life together. When Alina had turned 3, they had finally made the journey to Boston. Lillian's father, weakened by illness but clear-minded, had wept upon seeing his daughter and meeting his granddaughter. Though he remained in the sanatorium, unable to travel west, monthly letters now bridged the distance between them, a reconciliation made possible by Thomas's generosity and Lillian's hard-won forgiveness. As Thomas and Alina approached the house, Lillian shaded her eyes against the setting sun, her heart full at the sight of them. Alina was gesturing animatedly, clearly recounting some adventure from their ride, while Thomas listened with the attentive interest he gave to all his children's stories. When they reached the yard, Thomas lifted Alina down from her pony, then approached the porch with a smile that still, after 5 years, made Lillian's heart beat faster. "How are my favorite people this evening?" he asked, climbing the steps to press a kiss to Lillian's lips before ruffling James's dark hair. "Eagerly awaiting your return," Lillian replied, leaning into his embrace. "Did you check the north pasture? Fence is holding well," Thomas confirmed. "And Alina proved herself an excellent assistant, didn't you, sweetheart?" Their daughter beamed at the praise, her features a delightful blend of both parents. "I saw a fox, Mama. Papa said it was hunting mice." "Is that so?" Lillian responded with appropriate interest. "You must tell me all about it over dinner. It's nearly ready." As the family moved inside, Thomas lingered on the porch a moment longer, his arm around Lillian's waist. "Happy?" he asked quietly, a question he still posed regularly, as if wanting to confirm that the life they had built together continued to fulfill her. Lillian looked up at him, this man who had advertised for a bride and found a partner, who had offered a home and created a family. "Completely," she assured him, the truth of it evident in her eyes. "More than I ever imagined possible." Thomas's expression softened as he gazed at her. "They called you a bargain bride," he murmured, repeating the phrase that had once been a source of humiliation but had long since become a private joke between them. "And you said I was priceless," Lillian finished with a smile, rising on tiptoe to kiss him once more before they went inside to join their children, the living proof of a love that had begun with an advertisement and $50, but had grown into something truly beyond measure.